My name is Rudy Johnson, and at 65 years old, I never expected to be fighting for my family farm at my only daughter's wedding. This land has been in our family for 150 years, through droughts, floods, and everything in between. When Sarah married Brandon, I thought I was gaining a son, not losing my legacy. What started as a perfect day turned into a nightmare when Brandon revealed his true colors in front of 200 guests. Before I tell you how this wedding turned into a battlefield for my family legacy, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more stories about standing your ground when family tries to take what's yours. The first time I drove a tractor on my own, I was just 8 years old. My grandfather sat beside me, his weathered hands ready to take over if needed, but mainly letting me feel the rumble of the engine and the responsibility of handling something so powerful. That day changed me forever. I remember looking out across the fields that stretched to the horizon, knowing that someday all of this would be mine to care for. Our farm sits on 300 acres of Nebraska's finest soil, land that my great-grandfather purchased back in the 1872 after coming to America with nothing but determination and farming knowledge from the old country. Every building, every fence post, every tree on this property tells a story of my family's sweat and sacrifice. The main house was built by my grandfather's hands, expanded by my father, and maintained by me. It's not just property. It's our history written in wood and stone. Growing up, I learned every inch of this place. My father taught me how the soil changes texture from the North Fields to the South Creek beds. My mother showed me which wild berries were safe to eat and which mushrooms to avoid. This wasn't just education, it was passing down wisdom that couldn't be found in books. When my daughter Sarah was born, Martha and I agreed that we wanted her to have the same connection to the land. From the time she could walk, Sarah followed me around the farm, asking questions about everything. By the time she was 12, she knew how to check soil quality, plant seedlings with the perfect spacing, and even help deliver calves during birthing season. She loved this place as much as I did, or at least I thought she did. Sarah was always bright, getting straight, as through school without much effort. Martha and I were proud but not surprised when she got accepted to the state university with a full scholarship. We knew she'd come back to the farm eventually, maybe with new ideas about sustainable agriculture or organic methods. That was before she met Brandon. They connected during her sophomore year in some business elective she was taking. Brandon came from Chicago, the son of a real estate developer who specialized in turning rural properties into suburban housing developments. The first time Sarah brought him home during spring break, I could tell he was uncomfortable with farm life. He kept checking his expensive shoes for mud and complained about the lack of cell service in certain parts of the property. "Beautiful land you've got here, sir," he said while looking around with calculating eyes. "Must be worth a fortune these days with development pushing out from the city." I should have recognized that red flag right away. He wasn't seeing a home, he was seeing dollar signs. But Sarah seemed happy, and Martha reminded me that I hadn't exactly hit it off with her father at first either. Over the 3 years they dated, I watched Sarah change. She stopped coming home as frequently. When she did visit, she spent less time helping with farm work and more time on her phone. Her clothing got fancier, and she started making comments about how quaint or rustic our lifestyle was, as if she was a tourist rather than someone who grew up here. Brandon's influence became more obvious after their engagement. Sarah had once talked about taking agricultural business courses to help modernize our farm operations. Now she was interviewing for corporate jobs in Chicago, talking about getting away from all this isolation. Each time she said something like that, it felt like a small betrayal. "Dad, you can't expect everyone to want to live like this forever," she told me once when I expressed disappointment. "There's a whole world out there beyond these fields." The thing is, I never tried to force her to stay. I just wanted her to remember where she came from, to value what generations had built. Brandon, however, seemed intent on erasing that connection entirely. Martha did her best to keep peace between us. My wife has always been the diplomat in the family, finding compromises where I saw only principles to defend. She encouraged me to give Brandon a chance, to look for common ground. He makes Sarah happy, she'd remind me, and eventually they'll settle into their own rhythm. Young people need to find their own way. I tried, for Martha's sake, as much as Sarah's. I invited Brandon to join me fishing at the pond, offered to teach him to drive the tractor, even suggested he might like to learn about the business side of farming. He always declined, politely, making excuses about work calls or allergies. The wedding planning brought our differences into sharp focus. Brandon's parents pushed for an elaborate ceremony at some country club in Chicago. When Sarah suggested having it on the farm instead, I was surprised, but pleased. Brandon's mother looked horrified at the idea. But darling, what about the dust? And where would everyone stay? Surely there aren't enough decent hotels nearby, she said, not even trying to hide her disdain. Against all odds, Sarah stood her ground on this one point. I grew up here, and it's important to me. We can bring in everything we need to make it perfect. So that was the compromise. A farm wedding with city trappings. They hired event planners who transformed our barn into something unrecognizable, strung thousands of twinkling lights through the trees, and erected a massive tent for the reception. It looked beautiful, I'll admit, but it also felt like they were covering up the farm's natural beauty rather than celebrating it. The week before the wedding, I overheard Brandon on the phone while he thought everyone was out in the fields. "Don't worry about it," he was saying. "After we're married, I'll have plenty of leverage to make it happen." The old man's sentimental, but he's not stupid. He'll see the financial sense in it eventually. I walked away without confronting him, but that night I couldn't sleep. What exactly was he planning? I considered talking to Sarah but didn't want to create drama right before her wedding. Instead, I called my lawyer and friend Thomas, just to make sure all my affairs were in order. Something told me I might need protection soon, though even I couldn't have guessed how soon that would be. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect. June in Nebraska can be unpredictable, but we lucked out with 75-degree temperatures and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. I got up at 5 as usual to check on the animals before the day's events began. Farm work doesn't stop for weddings, though I'd arranged for my neighbor's son to handle the afternoon chores. By 7, the property was already buzzing with activity. Florists, caterers, photographers, and a small army of coordinators swarmed over everything. I retreated to my workshop, the one place that still felt normal. Martha found me there around 9, already dressed in her mother-of-the-bride outfit. "They need you at the house, Rudy," she said gently. "It's time to get ready." I nodded, setting down the harness I'd been mindlessly repairing. "Is she happy today?" I asked. Martha's eyes softened. "She is. And nervous. She needs her father." The main house had been taken over by the bridal party. Sarah was getting her hair done in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by bridesmaids and makeup artists. When I knocked on the door, the room fell quiet. "Dad," Sarah said, turning away from the mirror. For a moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to run to meet me when I came in from the fields, her face lighting up with uncomplicated joy. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," I managed to say, fighting back emotion. "Can we have a minute?" she asked the room, and everyone filed out, leaving us alone. Sarah stood up and took my hands in hers. "Are you okay with all of this, Dad?" Of course I lied. Why wouldn't I be? She studied my face the way she used to when trying to determine if I was being straight with her about something. "I know you and Brandon don't always see eye to eye, but I love him, and I want you to be happy for me." "I want whatever makes you happy," I told her, and that much was honest. "This farm will always be here for you, no matter what." Something flickered across her face then, something I couldn't quite read. But before I could ask about it, her mother knocked on the door to announce that the photographer wanted pre-ceremony pictures. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, under the ancient oak tree where generations of my family had picnicked, napped, and proposed. The event company had set up white wooden chairs in neat rows, with an elaborate floral arch framing the spot where the minister would stand. I had to admit it looked magical. The kind of setting Martha and I could never have afforded when we got married 40 years ago in the local church. Brandon's family arrived en masse about an hour before the ceremony, immediately clustering together like they were afraid of catching something from the country air. His mother Barbara kept using antibacterial gel every time she touched anything. His father Richard, a tall man with the aggressive confidence of someone used to closing deals, surveyed the property with the same calculating look I'd seen in Brandon's eyes. I overheard him talking to Brandon near the refreshment table that had been set up for early arrivals. "The northeastern parcel has the best views," Richard was saying quietly. "That's where you'll want to start the development. Higher-end homes there, mid-range closer to the road." Brandon nodded, checking his phone. "Let's talk about this later, Dad." Too many ears around. I pretended I hadn't heard, moving away to greet some of our longtime neighbors who were arriving. But my stomach clenched with anxiety. They were already planning how to carve up my farm. The ceremony itself was a blur. I remember walking Sarah down the aisle, her arm trembling slightly in mine. I remember the strange feeling of placing her hand in Brandon's, the symbolic giving away that felt all too literal. I noticed that during the vows, Brandon seemed distracted, his eyes occasionally drifting to someone in the audience. Following his gaze, I spotted a man in an expensive suit who didn't look like family or a friend, more like a business associate. Martha noticed my tension during the ceremony. "Breathe," she whispered from beside me. "This is Sarah's day." I tried to focus on the beauty of the moment, on my daughter's happiness, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, I clapped and smiled along with everyone else. But inside, a voice was warning me that something wasn't right. The reception began immediately after the ceremony. The event company had transformed the area behind the barn into an outdoor dining and dancing venue, with a wooden dance floor, dozens of round tables dressed in white linens, and more flowers than I'd ever seen in one place. The bar opened, and servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvre. I kept my eye on Brandon throughout the early part of the reception. He seemed to be making a point of introducing certain guests to each other, pulling people into huddles for brief, intense conversations before moving on with a practiced smile. The man I'd noticed during the ceremony was now talking with two other similar-looking businessmen, all of them gesturing toward different parts of the property. Martha found me watching them. "What's wrong?" she asked, following my gaze. "I think there's something going on," I told her quietly. "Brandon and his father have been talking about development plans for the farm. And now all these men in suits are here, looking at the land like it's already theirs." Martha's face showed concern. "Are you sure you're not just seeing what you fear? This is a wedding, Rudy. People are here to celebrate, not make business deals." I wasn't convinced, but I nodded. "Maybe you're right." The traditional wedding events unfolded. We had dinner. The best man and maid of honor gave their speeches, and Sarah and Brandon had their first dance. Throughout it all, I noticed Brandon drinking heavily, becoming more animated and less careful with each glass of whiskey. Around 8 o'clock, when the party was in full swing and most guests were feeling the effects of the open bar, Brandon clinked his glass loudly, calling for everyone's attention. This wasn't on the schedule. The DJ lowered the music, and the dance floor cleared as all eyes turned to the groom. Martha squeezed my hand under the table. "Here we go," she whispered, and I couldn't tell if she meant it in a good way or not. Brandon stood in the center of the dance floor, microphone in hand. His face flushed from alcohol, but his eyes sharp and calculating. Sarah sat at the head table, looking confused but smiling nervously. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate with us today," Brandon began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet reception. "Especially my new father-in-law, Rudy, who has not only given me his daughter's hand in marriage, but has provided this beautiful setting for our special day." Polite applause followed, and I nodded acknowledgement, though something in his tone set my teeth on edge. "You know, when I first came out here to this farm, I'll admit I didn't see the appeal," Brandon continued with a chuckle that several guests echoed. "I'm a city boy through and through. But over time, I've come to appreciate the potential of this land." The way he emphasized potential made my stomach drop. I glanced at Martha, who was sitting straight back now, her social smile frozen in place. Sarah and I have been discussing our future, and we've decided it's time to bring this property into the 21st century, Brandon announced, as if this was something we'd all been waiting to hear. I looked at Sarah, who wasn't meeting my eyes now. Her cheeks were pink, and she was staring at her plate. The Johnson farm has been stuck in the past for too long, Brandon continued, gesturing expansively. 300 acres of prime real estate just sitting here, growing corn and soybeans when it could be creating real value. The crowd was silent now, sensing the tension. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes darting between Brandon and me. So today, as part of our new beginning, I'd like to announce the first phase of Lakeside Estates, an exclusive development of luxury homes that will transform this outdated farm into a thriving community. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some of Brandon's family and friends nodded approvingly, while our neighbors and family friends looked shocked and uncomfortable. "Rudy," Brandon said, turning to face me directly now, "I've taken the liberty of having the paperwork drawn up." He motioned to one of the business-suited men, who promptly approached with a leather portfolio. "All we need is your signature to transfer the property into our joint management company, and we can break ground by fall." The tent had gone completely silent. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place as the scene unfolded. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mixture of rage and disbelief making it hard to breathe. "This wasn't discussed with me," I said finally, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Brandon's smile tightened. "Well, we're discussing it now. Think of it as your wedding gift to Sarah, to us." "Brandon," Sarah said quietly, standing up now, "maybe this isn't the right time." He waved her concern away. "It's the perfect time. Everyone's here to witness the beginning of our future." He turned back to me. "The deal is more than fair, Rudy. You'll receive a minority stake in the development, and you can keep the main house. We'll even name the Central Boulevard after your family." I looked around at all the faces watching this display, at neighbors who had farmed alongside my family for generations, at Sarah's childhood friends who had played in these fields, at Martha's cousins who had helped us rebuild after the tornado of '99. Then I looked at Brandon's associates, calculating the profit margins even now. "The farm is not for sale or development," I said, each word clear and firm. "Not now, not ever. This land stays in the Johnson family as a working farm." Brandon's practiced smile disappeared. "Don't be ridiculous. You can't possibly maintain this operation much longer at your age. Be practical." "My answer is no," I repeated, standing now. "And this is not an appropriate conversation for your wedding reception." Something ugly flashed in Brandon's eyes. "I don't think you understand the position you're in. Sarah is your only child. We are the future of your family. This farm will come to us eventually, one way or another. Then you can wait until I'm dead," I replied evenly, though my hands were shaking now. "And even then, there are conditions in my will about keeping this land agricultural." Brandon stepped closer, lowering his voice, though in the silence everyone could still hear. "You stubborn old fool. You'd deny your own daughter a secure future because you're stuck in the past? Sign the papers." "That's enough," I said, turning to walk away. I couldn't bear to make more of a scene at what was supposed to be Sarah's special day. But Brandon grabbed my arm, spinning me back around with surprising force. "Don't walk away from me. I'm not some farmhand you can dismiss. Sign the transfer papers now, in front of everyone, and we can all celebrate together." I looked into his eyes and saw nothing but greed and anger. Any pretense of respect or affection was gone. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. "No," I said simply. "Now, let's try to salvage what's left of this reception." What happened next occurred so quickly that many guests later said they weren't sure they'd actually seen it. Brandon's face contorted with rage, and he swung his open hand, slapping me across the face with such force that I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The sound echoed through the tent like a gunshot. Martha gasped. Someone dropped a glass. Sarah cried out, "Brandon!" in a horrified voice. My cheek burned, and I tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. For a man in his 30s to strike a man in his 60s, at his own wedding, in front of everyone. It revealed everything about his character that I had suspected but hoped wasn't true. I straightened myself, touched my cheek briefly, and looked at Brandon, who seemed momentarily shocked by his own action. Then I looked at Sarah, who was frozen in place, tears streaming down her face. She made no move to come to me, caught between her husband and her father. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the tent, ignoring the chorus of voices that rose behind me. I heard Martha say sharply, "Rudy, wait," but I kept walking. I needed space. I needed to think. And I needed to make some calls before things got even more out of hand. The farmhouse stood quiet and dark, a contrast to the lighted tent and music still playing in the distance. I walked inside, turned on a single lamp in my study, and closed the door behind me. My cheek throbbed where Brandon had struck me, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. I sat heavily in my leather chair, the same one my father had used before me, and took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to take our land. When I was just 12, a development company had pressured my grandfather to sell during a particularly bad drought. They'd used every trick in the book, from threats to sweet promises, even trying to turn neighbors against each other by buying surrounding properties. Grandpa had gathered the family together and said something I never forgot. Land is the only thing in the world worth working for, worth fighting for, worth dying for, because it's the only thing that lasts. I remembered how he'd rallied the community, reached out to his contacts in local government, and ultimately protected not just our farm but helped several neighbors keep theirs too. He didn't fight with fists or threats, but with strategy and relationships built over decades. I needed to channel that same wisdom now. This wasn't really about my pride or even the insult of being struck. It was about protecting a legacy that stretched back generations and forward to grandchildren I might never meet. But was I fighting for the right reasons? Was I just being stubborn, as Brandon suggested? I looked around at the photographs on my wall, pictures of 5 generations of Johnsons working this land. My great-grandfather breaking the first soil, my grandfather bringing in the first tractor, my father installing irrigation systems, Martha and me holding baby Sarah in front of the newly renovated barn. This wasn't just sentimentality. This was stewardship of something precious. My mind made up. I picked up the phone and dialed Thomas Davis, my attorney and friend, since grade school. Despite being a successful lawyer now, he'd grown up on a farm not 10 miles from here and understood what was at stake. "Thomas," I said when he answered, "I need your help. There's a situation at Sarah's wedding." I explained everything that had happened, including the slap and the transfer papers Brandon had tried to force me to sign. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Thomas said without hesitation. "Don't sign anything. Don't discuss anything further with him or his people. And Rudy, get some ice on that cheek." My next call was to Sheriff Mike Wilson, another childhood friend who had chosen law enforcement over farming, but remained deeply connected to our rural community. "Mike, it's Rudy Johnson. I hate to bother you on a Saturday night, but there's a situation at my place you should know about." I gave him a briefer version of events, emphasizing that while I didn't want to press charges for the assault, I was concerned about Brandon's business associates and potential fraud. "I was planning to stop by anyway to congratulate Sarah," Mike said. "I'll head over now and keep an eye on things, casual-like. No need to make a bigger scene unless necessary." My third call went out to 4 neighboring farmers who formed our local agricultural cooperative. I put them on speakerphone together and explained the situation. "We need witnesses and support," I told them. "Not for confrontation, but to show unity. Brandon and his people need to understand that this community stands together." All 4 immediately agreed to come over, promising to spread the word discreetly to other farmers at the reception. The final call was to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who I knew would understand exactly what was happening and have the authority to do something about it. James Porter had been my roommate in college before I dropped out to take over the farm when my father fell ill. He had gone on to law school and eventually became the state attorney general. We'd kept Christmas card contact over the years, and I knew he was currently investigating several land fraud cases involving coerced sales from elderly farmers. "James, it's Rudy Johnson. I apologize for calling your personal number, but I think I've stumbled into exactly the kind of situation you've been investigating." After explaining everything, including the suspicious businessmen present and Brandon's family connections, James was silent for a moment. "Brandon Lewis," he finally said. "Son of Richard Lewis of Lewis Development Group?" "That's him," I confirmed, surprised. "You know them?" "We've had our eye on their operation for some time," James said grimly. "They've been involved in several questionable land acquisitions across 3 states. I'm actually in Lincoln tonight for a conference. I can be there in an hour. Don't tip them off that I'm coming." By the time I hung up, I felt centered again. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about justice and protection. I went to the kitchen, put some ice in a dishcloth for my cheek, and looked out the window toward the reception tent. I could see people moving around, some leaving, others gathered in small groups talking animatedly. Martha was standing at the edge of the tent, scanning the darkness toward the house, clearly looking for me. I hated that her daughter's wedding day had been ruined, but this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Brandon set his sights on our land. After about 15 minutes, I walked back outside and made my way toward the tent. Before I reached it, Martha hurried to meet me, her face lined with worry. "Are you all right?" she asked, gently touching my cheek. "I'm fine," I assured her. "But things are about to get complicated. I've made some calls." Martha nodded, unsurprised. She knew me too well to think I would let this go. "What's happening in there is disgraceful," she said. "Brandon's father is threatening to sue us for breach of contract, claiming there was some verbal agreement about the farm. Sarah is crying in the bridal suite, and half the guests are leaving. And Brandon? Drinking more and making excuses to his business friends. He keeps saying you'll come around once you calm down." I took Martha's hand. "I need you with me on this." She squeezed my fingers. "Always. That boy struck my husband. There's no coming back from that." Together, we walked back to the reception. As we entered the tent, conversations stopped, and all eyes turned toward us. Brandon stood with his father and 2 of the business associates, whiskey in hand, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. I walked to the center of what had been the dance floor and cleared my throat. "I apologize for the interruption to the festivities," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The reception should continue. The bar is open, the band will keep playing, and there's plenty of food. But I do have an announcement to make in about half an hour, so I'd appreciate it if folks could stick around for that." Brandon sneered from across the room. "More announcements? Haven't you caused enough drama for one night, old man?" I ignored him, moving to speak with the band and the caterers, making sure they understood the reception should continue. Some guests had indeed left, but most remained, partly out of loyalty and partly, I suspected, out of curiosity about what would happen next. Sarah emerged from the bridal suite, her makeup smeared from crying but her head held high. She approached me hesitantly. "Dad, I didn't know he was planning to do that," she said, her voice shaking. "He told me he wanted to discuss future plans for the farm with you, privately after the honeymoon." I wanted to believe her. "Would it have made a difference if you had known?" I asked quietly. She looked away, unable to answer, which was an answer in itself. "You should know that I've called some people who are on their way here," I told her. "There are things about Brandon and his family's business you need to be aware of." Before she could respond, there was a commotion at the tent entrance. Thomas had arrived, leather briefcase in hand, looking every inch the serious attorney despite his casual Saturday clothes. He nodded to me and immediately began setting up at an empty table, laying out documents and making notes. Brandon watched this development with narrowed eyes, whispering urgently to his father. Richard Lewis straightened his tie and approached me with a practiced smile. "Rudy, this situation has gotten out of hand," he said smoothly. "My son's approach was perhaps too direct, but his intentions are good. Why don't we all take a step back and discuss this like businessmen tomorrow?" I think we'll get everything cleared up tonight, Richard, I replied calmly. In fact, here's someone who might help with that. Sheriff Mike had arrived, still in his civilian clothes but with his badge visible on his belt. He greeted me with a handshake and a concerned look at my swollen cheek. "Quite a party you've got here, Rudy," he said, before nodding to Richard. "Mr. Lewis. Been a while since you tried to buy up the Peterson place, hasn't it?" Richard's smile faltered. "I'm afraid I don't recall." "Funny. I remember it clearly," Mike said. "Especially the part where you tried to falsify wetland surveys to devalue the property." By now Brandon had joined us, putting his arm possessively around Sarah's waist. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Why is the sheriff at our wedding?" "Mike's an old friend," I explained. "Just stopped by to congratulate the happy couple." Thomas approached our group, extending a file folder to me. "Rudy, you'll want to see this. I took the liberty of running a financial background check on Brandon last week when you called me with concerns." I opened the folder and scanned the contents, my suspicions confirmed by what I saw. "Brandon," I said, looking up at my new son-in-law, "would you like to tell Sarah about your gambling debts? Or the 3 credit cards you've maxed out in the last 6 months?" Sarah pulled away from him, confusion and hurt in her eyes. "What is he talking about?" Brandon's face darkened. "This is ridiculous. My finances are none of your business. They are when you're trying to use my daughter to get your hands on valuable property to cover your debts," I replied evenly. "And they're definitely Sarah's business now that she's legally tied to you." Thomas cleared his throat. "There's more, Rudy. It seems Mr. Lewis Jr. here has already attempted to secure loans using the farm as collateral. He's been showing these preliminary transfer documents to at least 3 different banks, claiming the property transfer was already in process." Brandon's face went from red to white. That's not illegal. It was just preliminary work, contingent on tonight's agreement." "Actually," Thomas said, "representing yourself as having ownership interest in property you don't own in order to secure loans is fraud. And I have statements from 2 loan officers confirming that's exactly what you did." Sarah was staring at Brandon now, shock giving way to anger. "You told me we were just going to modernize parts of the farm, maybe develop a small section for income. You never said anything about loans or gambling debts." Brandon grabbed her arm. "Don't listen to them. They're trying to turn you against me, can't you see that?" Mike stepped forward. "I suggest you take your hand off the lady, son." The tension in our small group was drawing attention from the remaining wedding guests. Brandon's business associates were edging toward the exit, clearly wanting no part of whatever was unfolding. But before they could leave, another figure appeared at the tent entrance. James Porter, State Attorney General, walked in with the confident bearing of someone used to commanding a room. He spotted me immediately and headed our way, accompanied by a younger man I assumed was an assistant. Brandon was still focused on the confrontation at hand and didn't notice the new arrival. "This is insane," he was saying loudly. "You can't prove anything. It's all speculation and small-town conspiracy against outsiders." "Is that so, Mr. Lewis?" James said from behind him. Brandon whirled around, and I witnessed something I never expected to see. Pure, unalloyed fear washing over his face as he recognized exactly who was standing there. "Attorney General Porter," he stammered. "What are you doing here?" "I was invited by an old friend," James said smoothly, nodding to me. "Though I must say, it's an interesting coincidence finding you here. Saves my office the trouble of arranging a formal interview next week." Brandon looked like he might be sick. "Interview? About what?" "Oh, various matters," James said casually. "Fraudulent loan applications in multiple counties, misrepresentation of property ownership, and most recently, a very interesting pattern of elderly farmers being pressured to sell land at below-market rates through what appears to be coordinated harassment campaigns." He glanced at Richard Lewis. "A family business, I understand." Richard stepped forward, all pretense of friendliness gone. "You have no grounds for these accusations, and this is hardly the venue for such discussions." "On the contrary," James replied. When I received a call describing an attempted forced property transfer at a wedding, with the same tactics my office has been tracking for months, I felt it couldn't wait, especially given that we were about to execute search warrants for Lewis Development Group offices on Monday morning. The remaining guests were watching in stunned silence now. No one was even pretending this was still a wedding reception. Sarah had moved away from Brandon, standing closer to Martha, who had her arm protectively around her daughter's shoulders. "Is this true?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Were you just using me to get the farm?" Brandon ignored her, focused entirely on the legal threat now looming. "This is harassment," he sputtered. "My father has powerful friends. You can't just show up and make accusations without evidence." James smiled thinly. "Evidence is something we have in abundance, Mr. Lewis, including recorded conversations between you and two of your associates discussing how marriage to Miss Johnson would provide access to, quote, the perfect acquisition target, end quote." At this, Sarah made a small, wounded sound. She walked slowly toward Brandon, stopping directly in front of him. Then, with deliberate movements, she removed her wedding ring and placed it in his hand. "Get out," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Get out of my home. Get out of my life." Brandon looked around wildly, seeking support or escape. His father was already backing away, clearly planning to save himself. The business associates had disappeared entirely. Even Brandon's mother was gathering her purse, avoiding eye contact with everyone. "Sarah, baby, don't do this," Brandon pleaded, his confident facade crumbling completely. "I love you. The business stuff is complicated, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." "You hit my father," she said simply. "You tried to steal his farm, our farm, and you lied to me about everything. There's nothing else to say." I had never been prouder of my daughter than in that moment. Despite her tears, despite the public humiliation, she was standing tall and seeing clearly for the first time in years. Brandon's face twisted with rage and desperation. He took a step towards Sarah, but Mike moved between them. "I think it's time for you to leave," the sheriff said quietly. "Unless you'd prefer I place you under arrest for assault right now." Brandon looked around the tent once more, reality finally sinking in. His perfect plan had collapsed completely. Without another word, he turned and stalked toward the exit. "Mr. Lewis," James called after him, "don't leave town. We'll be in touch very soon." Brandon stormed out of the tent, heading straight for the parking area. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually try to drive away, despite his intoxicated state. Sheriff Mike followed him outside, clearly thinking the same thing. "Keys," I heard Mike say firmly from just beyond the tent opening. "You're in no condition to drive. I'll call you a cab." Brandon's response was inaudible, but from Mike's stance, I could tell there was resistance. After a brief, tense exchange, Brandon surrendered his keys, yanking out his phone instead, presumably to call an Uber or a friend. Inside the tent, the remaining guests stood in awkward clusters, unsure what to do. The band had stopped playing entirely, and servers hovered near the kitchen area, waiting for direction. This was so far beyond the normal wedding reception disaster that no one had a playbook for it. Richard and Barbara Lewis were making a hasty exit, accompanied by their remaining family members. Barbara paused briefly beside Sarah. "I'm sorry," she said stiffly. "I didn't know about any of this." Sarah just looked at her, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology. Barbara hurried away, following her husband. Attorney General Porter was speaking quietly with Thomas in one corner, occasionally glancing toward me. I could tell they were discussing legal next steps, but that would be for tomorrow. Tonight, there was more immediate damage to manage. I approached the band leader. "I think we can call it a night," I told him. "Thank you for your flexibility with all of this." He nodded sympathetically. "We've seen some wedding drama before, but this sets a new record. Do you still want us to pack up quietly, or should we play something while people leave?" I considered for a moment. Maybe one slow, quiet song as people say their goodbyes. Nothing celebratory, just dignified. As the band began a gentle instrumental piece, I turned to find Sarah. She stood near the cake table, which displayed an elaborate wedding creation that would now go mostly uneaten. Martha was beside her, both women looking shell-shocked. I approached carefully, unsure if Sarah blamed me for the public confrontation. "Sarah," I began, but before I could continue, she threw her arms around me, sobbing against my shoulder. "Daddy, I'm so sorry," she cried. "I should have listened to you. I should have seen what he was really like." I held her tight, my own eyes filling with tears. "You have nothing to apologize for, sweetheart. Nothing at all. But the wedding. All this money and planning. And now everyone knows I married a fraud." "No," I said firmly, pulling back to look her in the eyes. "Everyone knows you had the courage to stand up for what's right, even on your wedding day. That takes incredible strength." Martha joined our embrace. The three of us holding each other as guests discreetly made their exits. Some close friends and family members approached to offer quiet support before leaving, but most simply slipped away, understanding that we needed privacy more than platitudes. Within an hour, the tent had emptied except for us, James, Thomas, and the cleanup crew. Brandon had left in a rideshare, according to Mike, who promised to check in tomorrow. The business associates had disappeared so quickly, they might as well have been ghosts. James approached us, his official demeanor softening. "Rudy, I hate that you and your family got caught up in this. The Lewis operation has been on our radar for some time, but we didn't know they were targeting your property specifically." "Will Brandon face charges?" Sarah asked quietly. James sighed. "That's complicated. The fraud investigation is primarily focused on the father's development company, but Brandon's attempts to secure loans using falsified property claims will certainly be part of that. As for the assault," he glanced at my cheek, which was now visibly bruised. "I don't want to press charges for that," I said firmly. "The public humiliation and failed scheme are punishment enough." Sarah looked up at the darkening sky, where stars were beginning to appear above the farm. "I need to figure out how to get an annulment," she said, her voice hollow. "We'll help you through that," Martha assured her. "One step at a time." James and Thomas both promised to return tomorrow to take formal statements and provide legal advice. As they left, the enormity of what had happened finally began to sink in. The happiest day of Sarah's life had imploded spectacularly, revealing ugly truths that couldn't be unseen. The three of us walked slowly back to the farmhouse, leaving the event staff to dismantle what remained of the wedding. None of us had the heart to watch them taking down the decorations and packing away the remnants of shattered dreams. We sat on the front porch swing, just as we used to do when Sarah was young. Martha went inside briefly and returned with 3 glasses of the good whiskey I kept for special occasions. This wasn't the special occasion any of us had anticipated, but it seemed appropriate nonetheless. "What happens now?" Sarah asked after a long silence. "Whatever you want," I told her. "You can stay here as long as you need. Go back to the city, travel, anything." She took a small sip of whiskey, wincing slightly at the burn. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she admitted. "I spent 3 years becoming what Brandon wanted me to be. I'm not sure I recognize myself." "You're Sarah Johnson," Martha said firmly. "You're strong and smart and capable, and you're loved, no matter what." We sat there for hours, watching the stars and talking intermittently, sometimes about practical next steps, sometimes about memories from happier times. The conversation wasn't forced or rushed. We were simply existing together in the aftermath, providing the solid foundation Sarah needed to begin rebuilding her life. Around midnight, exhaustion finally overcame us. Sarah decided to sleep in her old bedroom rather than the guest cottage, where she and Brandon had planned to spend their wedding night. As she headed upstairs, she paused on the landing. "Dad," she said softly, "thank you for protecting our home, not just the land, but who this?" She gestured to encompass the house, the 3 of us, the intangible bonds of family that had withstood the day's trauma. After she disappeared up the stairs, Martha and I remained in the living room, too wired to sleep despite our exhaustion. "That could have gone very differently," Martha said, resting her head against my shoulder. "If you hadn't made those calls, "I just did what my grandfather taught me," I replied. "Stand firm, but fight smart. Use your connections and your community." "You were magnificent," she said, kissing my bruised cheek gently. My knight in dusty farm clothes. Despite everything, I laughed. For all the pain and drama of the day, we had emerged with our family intact and our farm secure. It wasn't the outcome we'd expected from Sarah's wedding day, but perhaps it was the one she needed to find her way home again. 1 month after the wedding that wasn't, I was alone in the North Field, checking irrigation lines in the early morning light. The rhythm of farm work had become even more precious to me since the confrontation with Brandon, each task a reaffirmation of my connection to this land. The legal aftermath had been swift and comprehensive. Brandon's father's company was under federal investigation, with multiple charges filed related to predatory land acquisition practices. Brandon himself had agreed to a plea deal on the fraudulent loan applications, receiving probation and mandatory financial counseling rather than jail time. The annulment was proceeding without contest, Brandon apparently eager to distance himself from the failed scheme and public embarrassment. Sarah had moved back to Chicago briefly after the wedding disaster, needing space to process everything that had happened. She stayed with a college friend, took a leave of absence from her job, and from what Martha told me after their frequent phone calls, spent a lot of time in therapy. I respected her need for distance, though it pained me to have her away during such a difficult time. I wondered if she harbored resentment toward me for my role in the public exposure of Brandon's plans, even though she had ultimately sided with me. These thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires on the gravel road that ran alongside the field. I straightened up, shading my eyes against the morning sun, and saw Sarah's car pulling to a stop. My heart quickened as she got out, dressed not in her usual city clothes but in jeans and a simple t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Need some help?" she called, walking toward me across the furrows. "Always," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual despite the emotion tightening my throat. "Thought you weren't coming until the weekend." She reached me and gave me a quick, hard hug. "Plans changed. Mind if I stay a while?" "You know you never need to ask that." We worked side by side for the next hour, checking and adjusting irrigation nozzles. Sarah remembered more than I expected about the system, asking smart questions when she encountered something unfamiliar. There was an ease between us that had been missing for years, even before Brandon. Eventually, we took a break, sitting in the shade of the old oak at the field's edge. I offered her water from my thermos, which she accepted gratefully. "I've been thinking a lot about this place," Sarah said after a while, looking out across the green expanse of young corn, "about what it means, what it's worth." I stayed silent, giving her space to continue. "Brandon taught me to see it as just real estate," she went on. "Square footage and potential development value. Dollars per acre." She shook her head. "But sitting in my sterile apartment in Chicago these past weeks, all I could think about was how the soil smells after rain. How the whole farm has this. I don't know. This heartbeat that you can feel if you pay attention. It's alive," I said simply. "Always has been." Sarah nodded. "I forgot that. Or maybe I chose to forget it because it was easier to go along with Brandon's vision than to admit I was betraying something important." She looked at me directly then. "I'm sorry, Dad. Not just for Brandon and the wedding, but for the years before that, for acting like this place was something to escape from rather than something to cherish." "You have nothing to apologize for," I told her. "Every generation has to find their own relationship with the land. I never wanted to force you to love it the way I do. But I do love it," she said, surprising me. "I always have. I just got lost for a while." We talked for hours that day, more openly than we had in years. Sarah shared how Brandon had slowly isolated her from family and friends who questioned his character, how he'd subtly undermined her confidence while making her dependent on his approval. Classic tactics of manipulation that she could recognize now but had been blind to while in the relationship. "The worst part," she admitted as we walked back to the house for lunch, "was that I knew in my heart that something wasn't right. But I was too proud to admit I'd made a mistake, too afraid of starting over. So I doubled down instead." "That's a very human response," I assured her. We've all done it in one way or another. Over the following weeks, Sarah stayed on the farm, initially saying it was just for the summer to clear her head. But as June turned to July, I noticed her making phone calls about remote work options and looking up organic farming certification requirements on her laptop. One evening in early August, she joined Martha and me on the porch after dinner, a notebook in hand and a determined expression on her face. "I want to propose something," she said, sitting across from us. "A plan for part of the farm." Martha and I exchanged glances, both of us momentarily tense, given the echoes of Brandon's plan for the property. Sarah must have read our expressions because she quickly added, "Not development." The opposite, actually. She opened her notebook. "I've been researching small-scale organic vegetable production, focusing on specialty crops for farm-to-table restaurants and farmers markets." For the next hour, she walked us through a detailed business plan for converting 20 acres of our land to intensive organic production, complete with projected costs, revenue streams, and marketing strategies. She had clearly put enormous thought into how this venture could complement our existing operations without disrupting them. "I'd want to start small," she explained. "Learn as I go. But eventually, this could generate as much revenue as 100 acres of conventional crops, while actually improving the soil through sustainable practices." I listened with growing admiration for her thoroughness and vision. This wasn't Brandon's exploitative scheme. This was a thoughtful evolution that honored the farm's heritage while adapting to changing markets and environmental concerns. "What do you think?" she asked finally, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I think your grandfather would be proud," I told her honestly. "And so am I." That fall, we broke ground on Johnson Heritage Organics, converting a small parcel near the road for Sarah's new venture. She moved permanently back to the farm, renovating the old foreman's cottage as her own space, while working alongside me to learn everything she could about both conventional and organic farming. The physical work seemed to heal something in her, the daily connection with growing things rebuilding her confidence and sense of purpose. She started attending agricultural workshops and networking with local food producers, becoming part of the farming community in her own right rather than just as my daughter. Brandon faded into the background of our lives, an unpleasant chapter rather than an ongoing presence. When the final annulment papers came through in November, Sarah marked the occasion by planting a young oak tree at the edge of her organic fields. "New beginnings," she said simply when I asked about it. Martha and I learned to adapt as well, finding the right balance between supporting Sarah's new venture and giving her the independence to make her own decisions, even her own mistakes. I had to bite my tongue sometimes when I thought she was approaching something incorrectly, reminding myself that innovation often looks like error to experienced eyes. By the following spring, 6 months after that disastrous wedding day, we had all found a new equilibrium. Sarah's first crops were in the ground, the legal issues with Brandon's family were resolved, and the farm continued its seasonal rhythms as it had for generations before us. One evening, as Sarah and I finished a late irrigation adjustment for her vegetable beds, we paused to watch the sunset paint the western sky in spectacular oranges and pinks. "You know what I've learned from all this?" Sarah said, her face glowing in the fading light. "It's not just about the land itself. It's about knowing what you value and having the courage to protect it." "You taught me that, Dad." "I think you always knew it," I replied. "You just needed to find your own way back to that knowledge." The farm would continue to evolve, as it always had. Sarah would make changes I might not have considered, bringing new energy and ideas to our family legacy. But the core values would remain: respect for the land, commitment to stewardship, and the understanding that some things are worth protecting at all costs. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a profound sense of peace. The confrontation at the wedding had been painful for all of us, but it had ultimately led Sarah home, both physically and spiritually. And in doing so, it had secured the farm's future in ways I could never have planned. The land would remain in caring hands for at least another generation. And in farming, that's all you can really ask for. Have you ever had to stand your ground to protect something truly important to you? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this tale of family, betrayal, and redemption resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories of standing up for what matters. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to come home to what truly matters. Thank you for listening. And remember, the most valuable legacies aren't things, but the values we pass on through our actions.